On October 31st, 2010, a rather strange show about a zombie apocalypse was launched that was apparently an adaptation from a popular comics about zombies. Here we are 14 years later. Sometimes you could say that the show is pretty much exactly the same as the comics are, and sometimes they are so bloody different that you don't even know that they are supposed to be related. So let's go through the 5 biggest differences between the show and the comics so far. You really want to stay until number 1, cause the last one is pretty crazy. Number 5. How Rick lost his hand. Quite a few people know that Rick lost his hand in the comics, but now it happened in the show. Fans were wondering for years if it'll happen, and it did happen. In the comics it happened in Woodbury, way back in the prison arc. So Rick, Michonne and Glenn went to inspect a helicopter that crashed in the woods, and they found a community of survivors. The governor welcomed them in, and they were all very grateful, and yeah, then he just cut Rick's arm off. Basically, he needed food for his walker pets and his walker daughters, so he just cut his hand off. This was really the moment when Rick realized that the world he knew was gone, and it really changed him. He was so nice and the governor just cut his arm off. It was insane. Rick then got a prosthesis similar to the Aaron's, and he was even more insane and capable in combat after that, so I just find it really ridiculous that people think that Rick will become less capable now when he doesn't have the left arm in the show. Which leads me to the show version of this. In the show, it happened at least 10 years into the apocalypse. Essentially, Rick tried to escape from the CRM, so he had to cut his arm off. He started to bleed out really badly, so they caught him though. It was an amazing scene, but yeah, these 2 ways Rick lost his hand was very different. One was completely unexpected and the other was planned for months by Rick. So these are more like opposites than similarities. They are very different. Number 4. Judy died in the comics for real. So in the show, Rick and Carl are convinced that Judith was killed by walkers, but in reality, Tyrese took her and watched after her until they all reunited with Carl and Rick, and now Judith has become a really big part of the story and will probably take Carl's comics lore in the future. She's an important character, but in the comics something much more brutal actually happened. So listen to this. So the governor gets through the gates and instructs his people to shoot everyone they see. Rick, Carl and Lori, who's actually carrying Judith, make a run for it, and Carl and Rick get away, but Lori is shot and falls to the ground, crushing the baby Judith that she was carrying. Dude, that was so insane when I read it for the first time. So they were actually very well prepared for Lori's childbirth in the comics, and she survived the childbirth, and then this happened when everything was just going so well. I get why they didn't include this in the show, it would be just too brutal. Seeing Lori and Judith die in an instant would destroy the viewership, but Robert Kirkman I guess just doesn't care, so he made this awesome scene, and holy crap, it's probably the most brutal scene in both the Walking Dead comics and the show, which says a lot. I get why they didn't include this in the show, and I really like Judith, so I'm happy we got both versions. That's one of the coolest things about adaptations in general. You can do it differently, basically like a big fanfiction. So I'm happy that we have both versions, one where she dies and one where she becomes a super important character. If you're enjoying the video so far, punch that subscribe button. Number 3. People that were killed by the Whisperers. This may come as a surprise, but this one is actually very big. You know when the Whisperers killed like 10 people and put them on the pipe thingies? Well, in the show, completely different characters are actually killed than in the comics. I didn't really want to include any character deaths on this list. I feel like the 5 biggest differences aren't really connected to a specific character, but this one is so different that I just need to talk about it. So in the show, some teens are killed, I forgot their names. There's also Enid, Tara and Henry. Now in the comics, there's actually 12 people that died, not just Stan, and the characters that died are Dante, which is actually a very important character in the comics, but also Rosita, yes, Rosita, and Ezekiel. So that was crazy. In the comics I felt that Whisperers weren't really that OP as in the show, and those little shits were terminated quite quickly after this, but hell, they really went wild here. The show really couldn't afford this many big character deaths just for this. Later seasons in general are kinda lacking iconic characters, in my opinion at least. I mean, I guess we are really lacking Rick Grimes, right? If Rick was there, they could afford to kill one more, I'd say. But yeah, it was different in the comics. I mean, Enid, Henry and Tara were awesome, I feel bad for them, but Rosita and Ezekiel, damn. Number 2. Daryl doesn't exist in the comics. Now this one doesn't really feel that important, but it is. Daryl is a fan favorite, of course, but the biggest thing about it is really that the show simply couldn't work nearly as well as it did after Andrew Lincoln's departure without Daryl. Yes, numbers dropped crazily after Rick blew up the bridge, but imagine if Daryl wasn't there either. That would be bad. Daryl is an awesome character, my favorite in the show actually. He also arguably carried basically the whole show after Rick. No offense, but I really believe this. this. He was the main character of seasons 9, 10 and 11. He was at the front of all the wallpapers. Without him it simply wouldn't work. I'm actually surprised that I didn't really miss him in the comics. I don't know why, but comics just have so many so good characters that I just forgot about him. But yeah, the show wouldn't be even nearly as popular without him. At least not after Rick vanished. Number 1. Now this one is big. I mean a really big one. So for those who don't really know, in the show the virus started in France. They basically experimented with a virus and caused it to mutate, and that's how the apocalypse started. Now listen to this. In the comics, the apocalypse is caused by space spores. Yeah, aliens caused the apocalypse in the comics. You see, Robert Kirkman said originally when he started the comics that the story is about aliens invading Earth and they caused a global pandemic to make it easier to invade the planet. He said all of this to prevent copyright issues, but the story of course isn't about that. Still, after comics ended, Kirkman just randomly made a tweet saying that the whole thing was caused by space spores. So in the show we can blame France, and in the comics we can blame aliens. These are the 5 biggest differences between the comics and the show. I know you have your opinion, so write your top 5 differences in the comments if you feel upset about not mentioning anything, as you usually do.
Written.